All right, we'll get started. We'll give it a couple minutes for folks to log in.
I want to find the person who was the voice for that recording in progress, that all of us have heard.
Right.
It's like for my portable speaker, the person that did the battery, battery low, please charge, like who is she?
Probably the same person.
Yeah, honestly, it probably is.
The guy who does the subway recordings. We'll find him next. Okay. Good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight, and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Rebecca Mead presenting her new book, Home/Land, a Memoir of Departure and Return. She's going to be talking tonight with Jia Tolentino, so you are in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Rebecca, Jia, and the team at Knopf for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. A couple little housekeeping things before we start. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the speech balloon. You're welcome to post comments and thoughts in the chat. Let us know where you're logging in from. Tell us the part that you love the most. It's a great way to interact with fellow attendees and show your appreciation for the authors. If you have a question you want to ask, you should post that in the Q&A, which is the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We're going to be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, Home/Land, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Avenue stores, where you can purchase Rebecca's book and many others on site, or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. And as thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the features book. Just enter the coupon code GreenlightEvents10 in the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. I'll drop that in the chat in a minute. So if you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Okay, quick introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Jia Tolentino, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of the book Trick Mirror, Reflections on Self-Delusion. She's also been a frequent interviewer on Greenlight stages, both virtual and in person, as well as a neighbor and supporter of the store, so we are so grateful to have her with us tonight. She's going to be speaking with our featured author, Rebecca Mead. Rebecca has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1997, where she has profiled many subjects and has contributed to more than 200 pieces to the talk of the town. She's the author of the books One Perfect Day and My Life in Middlemarch, a New York Times bestseller, which she launched with an event at Greenlight in 2014. She has served as a McGraw Professor of Writing at Princeton University and is the recipient of a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship. She lives in London, though for years she lived right around the corner from Greenlight in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and was one of our beloved regular customers. We'll always be grateful for the way that she welcomed Greenlight to the neighborhood from the pages of The New Yorker in the winter of 2009, and we have missed her and her family in the neighborhood since they returned to London in 2018. So it's particularly special for us to host this event for Rebecca's new book, Home/Land, a Memoir of Departure and Return, which is a moving reflection on the complicated nature of home and the heartache and adventure of leaving an adopted country in order to return to your native land. Jia Tolentino herself has called it a winsome memoir of departure and reversal about the way a series of unknowns accrue into a life. So Rebecca is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she's going to be talking with Jia and with all of you. So Rebecca, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for those kind words about our way back relationship in Fort Greene. It's really lovely to be back with you virtually. Also, thank you for articulating the slash in the title. You're the first person to actually speak it out loud.
I was actually just wondering, no,
I've never done that, but
it's very festive. Yeah,
maybe it's a good idea. I don't know, festive is kind of aggressive, but yeah. Anyway, it's new to me, so thank you. Anyway, let me read it. Let me read a little bit. This is from quite far on in the book, but it's actually something that I wrote early on. Let me see where to begin. Having precipitously dispossessed myself of a home that was sturdily built upon granite, According to the engineer who conducted an inspection for us, the very same stone from which the Brooklyn Bridge had been built, I learned when attempting to make a new home in London, this most basic fact about the city, that it moves. Cracks open up in brick facades, fault lines in the mortar zigzagging down from window ledges as in a comic book drawing of a devastating lightning strike. Doorways lean like weary mothers waiting at the bus stop. The end houses of Victorian terraces, those thousands upon thousands of dwellings thrown up across the city's sprawling geography by frock-coated speculators, are tied in, secured by metal pins that push through brick into wooden joists like old-fashioned brass fasteners through paper, restraining walls that have started to bow and bend. I had never before had reason to think about the structural stability of London's buildings, their tendency to slippage and subsidence, but I became obsessed with the phenomenon, pointing it out to my husband and son. See the elderly shuttered red brick pub near Regent's Park with the forlorn to let sign, the entire structure propped up with a massive timber buttress that resembles a medieval trebuchet. See the narrow lopsided row houses on Highgate Road, looking out upon lumbering buses and speeding bicycles with humiliated diminishment, like a once vital elder who has suffered a stroke. Even the city's grandest institutions are not immune. The high brick wall topped with fierce spikes that encircles the grounds of Buckingham Palace has succumbed, cracks forming in the gateposts of the Royal Mews. In St Mary's Undercroft, the chapel in the bowels of the Houses of Parliament, the eye is drawn to the vaulted ceiling built in the 13th century and lavishly gilded in neo-Gothic style by Victorian restorers. Underfoot, though, there are gaping cracks between the patterned tiles, creeping evidence of dubious foundations here at the heart of the British establishment. Not even the houses of the dead stand still. At Highgate Cemetery, which opened in 1839 on the steep incline of Highgate Hill, the interred contents of graves have been known to slide untethered from their gravestones down the wooded slope, the long departed shifting posthumously from what were intended to be their last resting places. Historic movement. This is the resonant term I've learned from surveyors and realtors to explain why many buildings in this city are settled permanently into a lopsided accommodation with their foundations and arrived at a compromise with instability. When I first heard the expression, I liked the poetry of it and embraced it with a kind of irony. Historic movement, it had a grandeur and decisiveness to it, as if it were the title of a book in which the disconcerting geopolitical moment were confidently analysed and understood, written by an academic political theorist or economic historian suddenly catapulted to popular fame. It seemed to sum up the moment in both the country I left and the one to which I returned, where the ground was moving underfoot in unprecedented ways. A new strain of nihilist populism was on the rise, enabled and magnified by untested forms of technology, spreading like cracks in plaster. In both countries, an engineering stress test was being conducted upon institutions, an experiment carried out to see just how far values like fairness, tolerance, and openness could be undermined before they fell into rubble. Foundations that once seemed solid were giving way, and structures that seemed secure were revealed to be vulnerable to collapse. What had been buried was coming to the surface. It was time for a change, I would tell those new neighbors who asked why I left New York, a light answer for a weighty question. The political situation had something to do with it, I might add. It's hardly better here, they might reply as we exchanged knowing, helpless glances. But what would be truer to say, if harder to explain, is that it was time for movement. The disequilibrium of the moment shook me on my foundations, but having been shaken, I found I could not merely shore up what had stood before. There we go.
That's one of my favorite passages.
Thank you.
Rebecca, I'm so glad to be talking to you about this book. I wish it was, as I have said, I wish it was in Greenlight itself and we could get a drink afterward and it wasn't, your bedtime in London, but
and your daughter's bedtime in Brooklyn. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm so glad to be here and I'm glad to be here with all of you. I wish, I'm from our own respective living rooms and kitchens. It's really nice. Someone's here from New Zealand. It's amazing. And I'm so happy to be here to celebrate my dear friend Rebecca and this beautiful memoir. Probably some of you read it, maybe some of you haven't yet. You know, you'll find that as with all of Rebecca's writing, every single page is pleasure to be savored. And as I emailed Rebecca, sort of, I think right after I read it, I was like, this book brought me, among many things, this book brought me to the particular realization that when someone says home, I haven't had a clear image in my head since I was very, very young, which is not a sad thing necessarily. I mean, there are gifts in dislocation. It's part of what this book is about, at least of, you know, I mean, we're talking at a time of great dislocation and you know, but of the very particular sort of dislocation that's marked your life and mine, there's enormous sort of strange plenitude in it. But I wanted to start off, I mean, we've already established that we are all within walking distance of Greenlight not so long ago, and I miss those days greatly. You know, we were neighbors for what now feels like a much too brief period of time. And I remember right when you guys were moving and emptying out the house, and you know, I got your desk lamp and, you know, like a computer monitor, and we were going for sort of a frenzied last minute walk, and you were and you mentioned this book. You mentioned that you were beginning to conceive of this book. And I remember you talked, if I'm remembering correctly, you know, it obviously wasn't yet about London so much, about what would happen after you returned, and this sort of retracing and finding yourself in the fabric of the city. I remember you were thinking of it as a memoir, sort of retracing your movement and the way, you know, the path up till then and the path up till departure. And I wanted to just start by asking you to talk about how you started thinking about the project and how it changed and how it became so much maybe more about England than you had expected it to be at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I think I remember the walk and the conversation too, and saying, "Do you think I should do it?" And thank you for encouraging me, and I miss you too. Yeah. So I mean, the book began really with an essay that I wrote for the New Yorker in the summer of 2018, which is when we left. And we left in a kind of, I mean, it's sort of in a hurry. I mean, you know, the decision was made and we were gone within about 5 months. So it wasn't a thing that had been sort of long discussed and long percolating. Although I think if I look back, I could see sort of, you know, I can find in emails suggestions much earlier going back that, you know, we were ready for some kind of a change. But I wrote a piece for the New Yorker with only a few weeks left in America. And that piece was about having become an American citizen. I know this is something else that you and I discussed, but
we had the Obama certificate rather than the Trump certificate. Thank God.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Like, you know, who are you going to swear who's going to be president when you swear your allegiance? And I luckily got Obama, but you know, so I wrote this piece for the magazine that was about having become a citizen and then feeling like, you know, I was giving up. I haven't given up my citizenship. I'm still an American, and I hope probably always will be. But I, you know, so I wanted to explain myself in some sense. I wrote this piece. I didn't ask my editor if he wanted it. I just went home one day after, you know, the latest round of incredibly upsetting news and just wrote it. And, you know, the magazine ended up publishing it. And that was very much a sort of cri de coeur and it was quite political, and it was sort of explaining what had become intolerable, and also, you know, what I was looking forward to in making this choice that I had never planned for, of returning to my home country, to the country of my birth. So that there was a tremendous response to that piece. I got loads and loads of, you know, I mean, lots of people telling me, well, good riddance, you know, good for you, off you go. But also a lot of people saying that they understood what I felt, and they too felt similarly. And lots of people for whom this kind of split, you know, lots of people wrote to me who had more than one country or more than one place that they belonged to, and that they were having second thoughts or third thoughts, or, you know, just that feeling of that this saying something that was not just specific to me, but was also true for a lot of other people. So that gave me the idea to write something. But it wasn't until I was here and I had sort of started to settle in that I really sort of summoned the courage to really formulate what it might be. And so by the time I was really seriously going to do it, I was already in the stream of discovering what it was going to be like to be in this new country. And it seemed to be a more interesting project to sort of try to understand and capture that experience of re-immersion rather than just sort of do more of the same of kind of retrospective, and certainly not kind of hectoring politically on stuff that would feel out of date immediately. It's great when you can put it in a magazine that's published the next week, but not when you have to wait 2 years. And I'm not really equipped to take that argument any further than I had taken it anyway. So, you know, it felt like a big enough thing that I was doing that I wanted to find a way to not just do it and then just have it kind of have happened and forget about what that experience had been like. But I wanted to sort of capture the moment as everything was so new and strange while also being so old and familiar.
I remember I had an old colleague whose family was from Syria and whose parents were big New Yorker fans. And I sort of snuck them up to the office one day to give them a little tour. And her dad wouldn't stop talking about that piece. And it was months and months and months after he published it.
Oh, wow.
And it was really, that was an amazing piece. And and there's this sense, as you write about in the book, and I remembering this from talking to you, it's like, there was such an intense desire and a drive and a need for there to be huge changes in the world, like for like a massive upheaval of a different kind, of a better kind, of a sort of voluntary kind to be possible, right? It's like there was so much about that time that felt paralyzing, and the viability of good things of your choosing happening, and the backdrop of movement became so much more complicated for so many people. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was rereading is you write about, part of becoming an American citizen in the first place was to give yourself not just the ability to stay, but to leave and return, right? My own mom she just voted in her first US election, like horrific voter suppression type things in Texas, by the way. They were like, the Democrat line is, over there and no one's staffing it. But she became a citizen recently in part to assure her ability to return, and it seems like, right around that time, as movement became so complicated, that ability to move freely, it shines brighter, and you're like, it became this precious thing that you have an ability to use. So you might as well use it.
Definitely. And I think, I'm tremendously privileged. I've got 2 passports. And if I could get more, I would. And, in our family, we sort of gather as many as we can. But, and I recognize it's tremendous privilege, especially when you're watching, with what's going on right now. And there are people, unable to cross borders, or unwelcoming countries, and it's a whole different thing, of course, to choose to move and to do it with all the luxury and resources that I had to do it. Still a dislocation.
It's still not to cut you, but you write about like that. People don't typically, like you write at one point, you were sort of beset with the fear that having once had the drive to launch yourself into the unknown, you would never be sufficiently brave to try it again. You're sort of reminded that, people move often, people immigrate when they're very young, you did. And, but it's not often that you do when you have formed a full life. And at one point in the book, you like, even given the sort of relative sort of ease of the circumstances surrounding you, it's like you write about being shocked by the sort of intense anxiety of resettlement. It's and just the tremendous amount of the paperwork and just the logistics and all of that is so all consuming. And you used the word earlier, that sense of paralysis that we felt in 2016 and thereafter. And I think that's a really good word for it, because
you did feel, I felt, trapped and frozen and unable to make anything happen. And maybe the only thing that I could make happen was to make myself be in a different place or to move. But, and there was also that sense of a kind of, impending change coming in ways that were unpredictable and that were possibly very unwelcome. And, I decided, and we decided, that we sort of wanted to get ahead of the whatever these changes were going to be, and to decide what the change was going to be for ourselves, for good or for ill. There are definitely, there's tremendous loss in leaving, not just losing Greenlight Bookstore and you as a neighbor, although that's huge, of course, but, we left family and my beloved siblings-in-law and my beloved stepsons and extended family, and it's terrible, and you can sort of only persuade yourself that you're going to be able to do any of that by saying, I'm not really leaving. I felt a little bit like, 15 years earlier I'd moved from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and I thought that, like, this is a bit like that, but just like the Atlantic's just a wider East River, but I'll still be back all the time. I'm not that far away. As it turns out, that hasn't been so easy.
And then nothing at all happened to make movement any more difficult for anybody, and you've been back constantly.
Yeah. Jokes on me. Yeah.
Well, so the move back to London, one of the reasons I'm having all these, I'm remembering you're having to get like a passport for your cat or something. Like it was like,
yeah. Had to bring the cats over. Yeah.
You talk
about, so they don't interrupt us, by the way.
But I remember you talk at one point in the book about how you can sort of imagine that the character of a city is determined by its geology, right? That the sort of like harsh, steely confidence of New York is that sort of like glacial bedrock, right? And in London, maybe the sort of ironic resignation of the city's character has to do with the fact that everything's just kind of like, the stones are just kind of slipping all the time. And there's a way, the move back to London and the time that you did it, and the just sort of the whole like existential 360 of it puts you back in touch with, or in new touch with the fungibility of things, the like ephemerality of what seemed fixed and solid, like a wall or a house. It's all slipping all the time. And you start, so much of the book is you start seeing the city as like a palimpsest. You see the layers of narrative and of time, and it's really moving. That at one point you shift in and out of all of these. You look at the Barrow and Hampstead Heath, and you imagine the ancient Romans looking at it, and you see at one point you talk about the Foxes have a city all their own in London that for them maybe has not changed, and it's still theirs, right? And how that way of looking at a city, how much of it was that moment and this project, and how much of it was the way you always try to understand place?
I don't think it's how I don't think it is a normal, I don't think it's a thing, a practice I've brought to other cities and then suddenly applied here. It really was something that I sort of became really consumed with and thought about all the time when I got back here. Partly it was this sense in London of this ancient history that is still so visible. And I find it like tremendously moving. You walk around the city of London and you bump into the ancient Roman walls of London. I'm told there are still, pipes underground that were laid by the Romans that still water could flow along. I don't think our water supply flows along them anymore, but they're still there, and even before the Romans. But this sense of these visible 2,000 years of history is really thrilling. And you turn a corner in London and you're passing tall skyscrapers, and then there's a Tudor building or a 17th century building or whatever. It's really very, the past is very, very present. And in New York, it's a younger place, and of course the past is present there as well, but having not grown up with that American history, it was, it was never sort of deep in me. But what was present in New York for me was my own history. I mean, I moved there when I was 21, and I had so much of my formative life was spent in those streets. And so, and I walked everywhere and I went everywhere, and I there wasn't a street corner that I felt I hadn't broken up with somebody on, or like had a fight with somebody at, or, like had too much to drink at, or written something about, or, gone and done an interview with somebody at. And there was so much of my own past was sort of knitted into the city. And whereas here in London, I was born here, but I moved away from here when I was 3. So I remember almost nothing of that. And I lived here for a very short period in my mid-20s when I made an erroneous decision to go back to England, and then quickly turned around and came back to New York. But I don't have any past here, and I don't meet myself walking the streets. And that's in some ways a relief, because there's something, sort of tragic about getting older and meeting your younger self on every street corner, and just like
getting something emanating from a bar storefront, like something happened there.
yeah. So that's something of a relief, but it's also very peculiar to like land in a place as a middle-aged lady, and that's all you've ever been in this place, and sort of like finding your way around it in this this strange with this strange absence of memory here. So in the book I go into my family history, and I sort of recover memories of that aren't my memories, but of my family's history. And in a way I was substituting history, like external history to me, and my own family's history for my own unlived years here, because I could so easily have had a life here. I could have just gone differently, and I don't think I'd have ended up in quite exactly the same place. But I don't bump into my own past, I bump into the past of the person I might have been.
And I pulled out the line, you write about this attempt to see London in this way as an attempt to weave yourself back into the city's fabric, where you were already woven into New York's just by the last, the previous couple of decades. And you write, I can only try to find kinship within London, both with the living I meet and the dead I've lost. And I wanted to ask you about the process. You mentioned that it becomes sort of finding physically the apartment where, or the building where your members of your family had lived, and in very different circumstances. And it's an interesting thing. Like, I wanted to ask you about the process of reconstructing a family history with relatively little in the way of documentation, because it seems very daunting. And you have these precious documents, you have some stuff, you have sort of parish records, you can tell what people were named, and and then you have these very precious documents, you have these very short sort of memoir, very short little books, you couldn't even call them that, really, written by your parents shortly before they died. And I wanted to ask you about, those specifically, what an unimaginably precious thing, and how did these things come into being? Like, did you prompt them to write them? And and I think I remember a line about, it's if your house ever bursts into flames, it's like you're grabbing these things. And what was it? Because you find the sort of ghosts and figures of like family past located in the city, but it seems like a very daunting archival task.
Yeah, and I'm not an archivist. I mean, I did have family trees and things that had been done by a relative that, so I didn't have to go and, find all of those things. There was stuff that had been done. Just as well, I didn't have to go and find them, because all the libraries were shut for a long period of time. But yeah, so I had some of these, and I did have, birth certificates. And it's interesting. There was a family legend in my family of my mother's mother was called Ellen, and there was a story in my family that it wasn't until she was in her 80s and needed to hand her birth certificate into the nursing home where she was living, that she learned that her name was actually Helen. And she'd been Ellen because, being a Londoner, she dropped the H and just called herself Ellen. Actually, that's not true. I mean, I'd grown up with this story, not grown up, but I mean, I'd heard this story and checked it out with my cousin, and people, do you know this story about Ellen? Yeah, it's all true. But I've got her birth certificate and she's Ellen. She never was Helen. So I don't know where this story came from, but it speaks to something about, yeah, it's like one of those, you know, like too great to check stories. But I mean, it's also, you know, it says such a lot about my family. But so I didn't have very much. And I did have, as you mentioned, these, you know, a few pages that both of my parents had written for me. My mother, who's still living, wrote hers first. And I think it was probably about 15 years ago, although I don't remember exactly. And I'm pretty sure I asked her to do it. And I don't remember what, you know, whether somebody, you know, whether I'd heard from somebody else that they'd had their parents do it or something like that. But I asked her to do it. And she wrote this sort of wonderful short narrative of her life up until my brother and I were born. And then a few years later, my father did it too. And my father's no longer living, but I can hear his voice. And when I open these pages, and there's this kind of quiet irony and sort of sense of resignation and slightly mournful tone to it. And I would, you know, urge all of you to ask your parents if they're not writers. And, you know, my son will have, Jesus Christ, my, you know, like, I've got, what am I going to do with all this stuff, you know? But if your parents haven't done the terrible thing of writing books about their lives, you know, ask them to write about their early years for you, because it's so precious. And you know, I know people sometimes, like, you know, record their parents or interview them or that kind of thing, but I guess we, you know, my family, we write. So yeah, they wrote, and it's, yeah, they're very precious. Yeah.
I just had a flash of being like, oh my God, Paloma's gonna grow. Like, I sometimes remember she's gonna grow up and be like, why did you do this to me?
But the thing is that it'll all be on the internet and therefore inaccessible somehow. It doesn't, you know, you sure
hopefully.
Of it, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, yeah, by then the whole, it'll all have just melted into into the sand. Well, speaking of Raphael, there's this great scene where you go to a party. Oh, I should also say, there are already a couple questions in the chat, but if any of y'all want to drop more, we're gonna, the last maybe in like 10 or 15 minutes, we'll go to y'all's questions. So drop anything in there. Yeah, so there's a scene where you go to a party and you find yourself sort of protesting against the idea that, you know, you've come back to London to turn your son into an Englishman, you know, and you talk about, I mean, and this part of your book I think about a lot. You write about this sort of much more specific legacy you wanted to give him, you know, and it's a questionable gift, you say, a lost place to long for. And I wondered, at what point in the chronology of this story did you realize that that was the gift? You know, there are many other gifts, right? You write, it was excerpted in the New Yorker about the very particular sort of London English that he speaks now, like all of the experience of two different kinds of sort of teen freedom and wildness that he'll get in both places. There's so many more gifts, but that specific one, the one that involves longing, that sort of irrevocably involves longing and dislocation. When did you realize that perhaps was like a driving thing that you really, really wanted him to come away with?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I feel for myself that you know, I grew up in a provincial seaside town, always knowing I was going to leave, and knowing I had been born somewhere else and that I had been sort of displaced from my home city of London when I was 3 years old, and always feeling a little bit like I'd been deprived of this inheritance of the city of London. And always knowing that I would have to you know, propel myself out of this backwater town that I was from was just, you know, always part of my consciousness and such a driving force for me in my life. And everything I've done and moving to New York and, you know, becoming a writer and all of those things is all in reaction to, I got to get the hell out of here, you know, and not that it was a terrible place, but it was like there was nothing going on, so I had to get out. And I, you know, it's just the old phrase of character building. That's what built my character, doing that thing for good or ill. And I think that New York can be so intoxicating and so you know, I mean, the city can grant young people such a sense of there being nowhere else that there is worth being, or nowhere else that matters. And of course that's wrong. It's objectively wrong, but I just think it's very, very limiting in an individual to feel that you're at the center of everything from the very beginning. And right. So, and I, you know, and my son, in some like almost perverse way, I wanted him to have the experience of what it's like to be an outsider and to not be the individual around whom this entire society is structured to, you know, make you thrive more than everybody else. Or, and I, you know, but it's, you know, that's a kind of weird thing to wish onto your child, that they might be more uncomfortable, or they might.
I know. I think about this constantly, I have to say. No, it's exactly what you said. Like, yeah, my entire life up to this point has been by, you know, the similar sort of thing. It's like Houston's a giant city with a million things to do, but I was like, I gotta, you know, and I think about how, you know, suddenly I have a child who's growing up in a kind of environment that I didn't even know existed until I was in college, you know, and I can easily, I mean, not only can I imagine it, I think I feel the beginning traces of that, even though it's strange to say. I wish you were a little more uncomfortable. But.
Yeah. You know, and I mean, it hurts me when he comes home and you know, if there's some, you know, being an American isn't always the coolest thing in the whole world. And, you know, the British have a certain kind of, have still got a certain kind of like slightly dismissive attitude towards America, especially post-Trump, you know. And I, you know, it's not always the easiest thing. And like not having your accent recognized, you know, I found it uncomfortable. He finds it uncomfortable, but you know, it's not the easiest thing. But I do think that it is a broadening thing. I think it's good to know that life can be arranged in ways different from the way that you've always thought it would be, because, you know, it's not like learning another language. It's not like being able to think in another language, but it is being able to think in another framework. And, you know, I hope that that's a good thing. I mean, of course, what I may have done is just made him someone who never knows where home is. And that, you know, maybe that's sad. But maybe that's what I mean by the questionable gift.
Yeah. I mean, I'm one of those people, and I think it is a gift, you know. Well, a couple more questions. Do you, at one point you talk about sort of reconstructing the period of departure through your camera roll, which is like, it's like the really poor substitute for a reporter's notebook that has, you know, it's like I got to go through my iPhone screenshots to see what I was thinking about, because I was like too lazy to actually write them down. But I was wondering, you know, I mean, you go back, you know, the period of your 20s of, you know, being like reporting on nightlife and taking a shot of vodka and a shot of espresso and then heading out to, you know, it's rendered very vivid. And I wondered, like, to what extent had you, because I don't know this about you, are you a journal keeper? Like, do you have extensive, how did you reconstruct?
Yeah, I mean, when I am not anymore. I mean, I sadly let that lapse a long time ago. And so, which I regret, but it's a habit that I have tried to, you know, revive, and I just have lost the knack. But I kept journals for years and years and years. And
when did you stop?
But the problem, when did I stop? I was probably in my early 30s when I stopped.
Was it when you started working at the New Yorker?
No, it was probably a little bit after that. But the stupid thing about my journals, though, the really stupid thing about them is that they're full of what I was feeling. You know, and the sort of like me being upset, or what, you know, this, like, you know, none of it is like, oh, I met this interesting person, here's the interesting thing that they said, which is what I would now I'd love to read. There's none of that, you know, it's all just so then,
it's like the spillover for emotional crises only.
Yeah, it's so dull. But what I do have are letters that I wrote, because I wrote, this was again, when I moved to the States, it was before I didn't have a phone. And I actually didn't have a phone at all. And there's obviously no email or anything like that. So I was writing a letter once a week back to my parents. And I kept that up for forever. And, even once I started to be able to, they had a fax machine installed, and I would send them faxes, and, and then eventually moved to email. But that's always how we communicated. We didn't talk on the phone. And, excuse me. And my mother kept all these letters, and she kept them all more or less in order too. So I have this vast archive of and in those letters, I did describe, who I was seeing and what they said, and like too much of the time what I said, which is not so interesting, but what they said sometimes is good. But, just the details of office life and the clothes, and, just those strange textural things that at the time are just, the kind of things that you'd write down in a reporter's notebook. And I wanted to convey the content of, the texture of my life, without giving away too much of the sort of boring inward, agonies that I saved for the stupid journals.
When this is so, I imagine it must have been so amazing and intense to read through those, and to feel like those specific days wash back over you.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of them I read certain periods, but I did not read the whole. I haven't read through the whole archive. It's
really
too much. I mean, I might go back.
Yeah.
I might.
No, I mean,
I
can't read old notebooks. I used to also be a very voluminous journal keeper, and I've tried to resuscitate the practice like to middling effect, but it's, yeah, I mean, well, I'm very curious about these actually though. Did you find that the tone in which you presented that early period to your mother, was it the same as how you remembered those years in your head, or had you sort of like, did you add a specific, was there any sort of tonal shift in the way you wanted to present, this is my new life in America?
I don't know. I mean, I think somehow maybe I didn't go back and read them and think, wow, that's not how I remember it. I really was, maybe I'd forgotten a lot of it too, but it was like, it was like, if you leave anything long enough, it becomes kind of, the texture of it becomes really interesting, and the history of it becomes really interesting. I mean, I remember like years ago when the New Yorker was moving from one building to another, and we had to empty out all of our crap and like throw things away, and I had to empty out a drawer that had not been emptied since the late 90s, and it was full of all these things that were just garbage, but they were they suddenly had the glamour of history, like the charge sheet that you would use for a town car that would take you from Condé Nast to the airport back in the days when Condé Nast would pay for you to have a town car.
Yeah, don't tell me about these things.
No, I mean, this sort of a Rolodex, a Rolodex, with like Ed Koch's phone number in it and things like that. It was so, I mean, just like the day-to-day stuff of work, you leave it long enough, it's like Mad Men,
Period piece.
Yeah. So the stuff, this stuff was just, I had just been writing about, my day, but it turned out to be, full of these kind of colorful details of now long gone history of magazines in the 90s.
Well, right. And it's also like it's a different kind of dislocation. It's like that there is, it's back to that point. I mean, it's a dislocation in time, but what there is like almost automatically, like there is a gravitas to that, no matter, in the loss of whatever world is gone and only represented in the Rolodex with, with people's phone numbers in it, that you can't even believe. Like it's, I mean, I think I feel like so much of the book is about that it's like you can't really escape dislocation, that it's like sort of metaphorically represented by the passage that you read at the beginning. It's like you there are various forms of dislocation that we'll all experience throughout our lives, that some of which might precipitate massive sort of global movements, global personal movement. But it's ultimately like we have to make our home within it. You have to reside within the state of perpetual dislocation that, if anything else, if nothing else, is just time also, and then, it sort of comes in towards the end of the book. You moved back. One of the things that you were looking forward to in terms of moving back was to be closer to your mother. And you end up, the pandemic happens, and for all of this about wanting to sort of enact the precious freedom of movement, that was available to you, and to be, you're separated from your family in the US, but you're closer to your aging mother. And then the pandemic hits, and everyone's grounded at home, including her and including you guys. And this is in the last 2 years of not being able to go anywhere. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's a facile question, but how, like, do you understand all, you were working on this book. When did you finish the manuscript?
I finished it in January 2021. So I wrote it
right.
Most of what is in it was experienced between sort of late 2018 all through 2019. But I wrote it in the sort of second half of 2020 during the pandemic. And so it was written, the pandemic comes into it at the very, very end, and but is kind of alluded to or hinted at maybe in different ways in earlier moments. It was written very much in that moment of stasis, and also really missing New York and missing America, and not being able to get back, and having been deprived of this freedom of movement that I thought I would have, and that I had sort of banked on in order to be able to leave. So it was written with a lot of nostalgia for, and sadness over not.
Do you think how much did that experience of being of writing it from your house, not being able to avail yourself of the sort of great tide of fungibility that spurred the move in the first place? Do you think that you'll look back on this as something that was marked by, to what extent did the pandemic change the way that you were thinking about rootedness and separation?
Well, it could. It has changed it, and now we're facing war in Europe. It's the expectations that I and lots of us have had about what our freedoms might be are all constantly in question. But that's one way in which the pandemic has changed things for me, is the realization of that I'm further from America than I was pretending I was.
The very large East River.
And that Britain is more of an island than I wanted it to be. And the idea of I came back here post Brexit. That vote had already happened, but the legislation hadn't yet been enacted, and it was this interim period where things were still mobile a little bit, and and I couldn't quite believe that we would sever ourselves from Europe, but it went through, and we did, and yet I still held on to this idea that yes, but we're still obviously connected. We're always going to be connected, and that becomes harder and harder when borders close, and you're just stuck on a little island surrounded by cold water.
On that note, we're gonna go to okay, we'll go to questions from the audience. If anyone has any more, drop them in, but I'll just go in order. Question from Chris. What is the biggest change you've seen in your son from the move? And who is your all-time favorite magazine colleague? Me accepted, of course.
Oh God. I can't answer that. But I'll tell you who comes into mind is our late beloved colleague Janet Malcolm, who died last year, and who I know you got to know a little bit in her last years, and and we had some good times with her and some of our other colleagues, and so she's not my favorite, but she was the one that was, I couldn't believe she was my colleague and my friend, and it was always such a thrill to be around her. But but I love all of them, of course, obviously.
I remember you wrote that beautiful in the sort of staff remembrance of her, that the last email she had written you about your cat getting out.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Because she'd written to me about my cat escaping. Oh, yeah. It's funny to think of, the formidable Janet Malcolm being as cuddly about cats as she was, but she was.
Yeah.
So no, my son, the biggest change, he's 16 now, and he was 13 when we moved. So the biggest change is puberty. It's the country of puberty. It's not really the UK or America. And I don't know what he would have, he and I were talking about it the other night, like what would he be like? Where would he have gone to school? Who would his friends be? He still speaks with an American accent. He doesn't speak the, multicultural London English that we were, that I wrote about and that was accepted in the magazine. Although we were just now together before this happened watching the TV show Top Boy, which you may or may not know, on Netflix, which is about sort of gangs in East London, and it's all spoken in this, basically all the characters in it speak this multicultural London English, and he can understand. I'm like, what did they say? What did they say? And he said, he knows, he can understand it. So that's one change. He can speak the language of the young people of London, which is awesome. That's a phrase that he would still say because he's American.
Okay, another question from Jane. So just a small question about, obviously there are a million ways you could answer this, but Jane is asking about, if you could just quickly sum up the difference between the government in England and America and the citizenry in both countries. Okay, maybe let me narrow this a little bit to ask, like, what is, like, yeah.
I might begin by saying, no, I've got no idea.
Well, I mean, because it's not like you weren't already familiar with what English people are like and what the what the political situation was, but I do wonder, what were there aspects of it once you were immersed within, like once you were fully back, that seemed different than it had when you were observing from the vantage point of New York?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's turned out to be worse here than I anticipated. I mean, I guess I did not really believe. I hoped that Britain had grown up enough not to elect Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister, the thing that he'd wanted to be since he was a child, and that he was always aiming to be. And I really hoped that the country had grown out of needing to have an Etonian, whatever, for as the leader of the country. And so that was disappointing. I think maybe that's the main thing. I mean, I could go on and on, but that
you didn't think Boris Johnson would actually get I mean, fair enough. Okay, a question from Kelsey. How did your parents' writing, specifically in those two precious documents, influence your own sense of self, or shift your relationship to or understanding of being part of a lineage?
Oh, that's so interesting. I mean, I think that so much of my self-identity as a young person and as a as a grown-up person was in establishing a self that was nothing like my parents. I mean, my parents met when they were 15, and they married when they were 21, and they've been together their whole lives. And neither of them my father stayed at school till he was 16. My mother left school at 15. They didn't, go to university. They got jobs when they were, in their mid-teens, and they were adults already by the time they were 16, 17 years old. They come from a very different world than the world in which they were able to raise me and my brother, for all kinds of different reasons. And I felt I somehow felt that I had sort of created myself, and that I was quite different from them. And there's something about, getting your parents to, if you're a writer, getting your parents to write something, because they weren't writers. Neither of them was a professional writer. And I'm the only one that said there's ever been in my family. But it turns out they can both write. And turns out my dad is quite a funny writer, or was. And there's something very poignant about the giving them, not me giving them, but them having the space to do something creative and do something, and to express themselves in ways that they normally didn't. And they're English people, and they were my father especially was quite a reserved man, and didn't wear his heart on his sleeve at all. And so there was something really amazing about having this text from him, which is, if I read it aloud to myself, it's the longest I've ever heard him speak.
Did either of them ever signal that they had ever liked writing in any capacity?
Yeah, I didn't know until I had become a journalist before I learned that my father had wanted to be a sports reporter, that he'd wanted to work for a sports newspaper, but his own father died when he was 17, and he had to go out and get a proper job and earn a living and help contribute to the family. And so that dream was lost. And then and the thing, my mother, not so much about writing but reading. That was the sort of wonderful thing about my mother. When I went away to university and studied English, I felt myself, at every step past the age of 15, I was going further than my parents had gone in school. And so I went away to university, read English, and left all my books behind when I moved to America. And my mother started to read them. She started to read them while I was studying them in university. So she started to read, Virginia Woolf and George Eliot and all these other writers that she hadn't read before, and discovered that she loved them. And Mrs. Dalloway is her favorite book, and it's the book that she goes back to and reads again and again. And that's really, I find that just really, really wonderful.
That's so lovely.
That a woman who was told that she wasn't good when she was in school, that she was a failure as a student, and that she didn't know anything, later found a way to take pleasure in the things that had given so much to me.
That's so lovely. Okay, I guess last question from Alex. How did the final book end up being different than how you originally conceived it?
Oh, I don't think, when I started writing it, I didn't know what I was doing. So, it didn't end up being what it was until the very last moment. This was a book, unlike the last book I wrote, My Life in Middlemarch, which I had a very, structured framework, and I knew not that I knew what I was doing, but once I started writing it, I knew where I was going to end up, and I basically knew how I was going to get there. This was much more of an exploration as I was writing it, sort of figuring out what the story that I wanted to tell was, and what the themes that I wanted to explore were. So, it didn't end up different from what I imagined it was going to be. I didn't know what it was going to be until it ended up.
Like life.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're at 7, and sorry, you can hear.
Oh.
Said hi.
Hi.
Rebecca, thank you so much. And thank you guys for being here. And thank you, Greenlight, for hosting us. It's been such a delight. Everyone buy the book from Greenlight if you don't have it already, or buy a copy for a friend. It's so beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much, Gia, for doing this. It's really so great to see you, and thank you for having us at Greenlight. It's really lovely to be back in this weird way.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's such a treat to see you and hear you guys talk about being neighbors and all of this wonderful conversation. It was so nice to like be a fly on the wall for that. So thank you so much. I hope you both have a great evening. The book link is in the chat. The book is so wonderful. So thank you again. We appreciate it, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.